trade law. I will try to keep it simple, and I will also try not to speak very fast. But if you don't understand, please just raise your hand or make a very puzzled face, and I will try to speak more slow and repeat myself. Today I will address more or less 3 parts, and the first one is halal and food security. The second one is halal food in European Union law, and the third one is halal food in WTO law, so International Economic Law, if you want to speak about it like this. First maybe I have to justify a little bit. The other speakers, yes, have already tried to do so a little bit. So what is really the link between halal and food security? Because maybe it's not that obvious. In 1974, we had a definition in the World Food Summit here, and this one was very much based on supply. Do we have enough food? So traditionally, food security was conceived of as do we have enough to eat, very simply. But we see over time, the definition gets more complex. So we now pay attention to, is it safe, is it nutritious, and also does it fulfill dietary needs and food preferences. So we see a more social conception of what food security is also in, let's say, the policy-making documents. This one is from the FAO, for instance. So we see a little bit this shift towards social preferences, and that's why halal now can be seen as being a part of a broader definition of food security. This is my first point to justify why I speak about halal in international food law. The right to food, as you see, has the same tendency. So you also see here that adequacy is no longer defined by nutritious quality, but it also takes into account non-nutrient values such as religious preferences. So law is a social concept. You see over time our conception in society of the right to food has also changed. Well, in the European Union, I want to speak about halal regulation. I want to first show you how halal is not regulated actually, before I speak about how halal is regulated. And in the European Union regulation, basically you will see that we have a lot of food law, really a lot of it. So for instance, we have regulated food law, this means there is EU law. And we have unregulated food law, which means there is no EU law on a specific topic. You can also distinguish between mandatory law, so it has to be on food products, and voluntary regulations that are applicable if you choose to do something. I will give examples and it will become much clearer what the distinction is. For example, how do you label your food product? You have to put the mandatory information about, for example, ingredients on a food product. Therefore, this is a regulated and mandatory regulation. But you do not have to produce organically, for instance. We do have an EU organic regulation, but only if you choose to produce organically do you have to put the organic logo on your product. So this is why we call it's regulated but voluntary. Because you as a business producer can choose to comply with organic law, but if you use the organic logo, there is public regulation telling you what to do with it. We have some unregulated things. There are very few in the European Union because we have a lot of regulation. But what I want to say in the context of this presentation is that we have unregulated and voluntary information or regulation, and that is, for instance, halal. So in the European Union, halal is a private standard, but it is not a public standard. This means that we have companies, and actually competing companies, that are certifying a product as halal. So this is why I have this matrix, to show you that in the European Union, we are speaking about voluntary, unregulated things when we speak about halal foods. For example, these are a number of private schemes, and as I said, they don't have public regulations, they make their own rules, and they can be quite different rules. This is why in the European Union, many Muslim consumers are complaining that actually the standards are not very strict and definitely not very well enforced. there is competition also between all of these stamps, let's say. Therefore, as a result, in the European Union, halal food is targeted by the law only indirectly, and mainly when it comes into conflict with one of our general food laws. We have two cases at the moment in the European Union, so really at European Union level, not at member state level, but at the supranational level. And one is where halal was dealt with under the animal killing regulation, because we have rules of how to kill animals for food, and one where it came in touch with the organic regulation. So these are the two cases we have at European Union level that deal with the law and halal. In the animal killing regulation case, what happened is that this targeted actually this EU regulation. It's an EU law, and the basic rule in the European Union is that animals can only be killed after stunning. This is one of the basic rules. However, the law also recognizes the right of religious slaughter. So there is an exception for religious slaughter, such as halal, but it's not specifically for halal because it could be for kosher as well. And the exception is that slaughter can be done without stunning, but then it has to be done in a slaughterhouse. So you must have a special certified facility where animals are slaughtered. So this is the European regulation about slaughter. And the case that reached the court was a little bit interesting because it was alleged that the law violates the right of freedom of religion in the European Union. So actually the law itself was attacked. However, the court said no, this is already a balance between welfare. You can actually have non-stunned slaughter, but it just has to be in a slaughterhouse, and this is proportional. So it's not a total ban on religious slaughter, but it's just a specific condition, and that's why it was okay. So you see here in the EU that religious or freedom can come in touch with animal welfare, basically. This is the main tension in the European Union. The second one where it came out a little bit stronger was the question of the organic regulation and whether the organic regulation can be used with something or on meat that was slaughtered in non-stunned slaughtering processes. So the question is, our organic logo, is it compatible with non-stunned slaughter? The answer of the European Court of Justice said it's not possible. And this is a quite recent judgment, and it was very important for the industry. Because basically it means that if you have a halal standard that relies on non-stunned slaughtering, then this halal standard cannot be on a package with the organic certification logo. So this was very important. And here the reasoning was basically that the animal welfare in the organic regulation does not allow non-stunned slaughter. So this is simply how animal welfare in this case works against non-stunning. I want you to note that in the European Union it's really about the technicalities. So it's not about halal, it's about the technicalities. It's the question of non-stunned slaughter, and as I understand it, even in the Muslim community, maybe this is a point where it's not entirely clear on which side the halal always falls. So at the end of the day, this is not about halal, it's about a very technical rule, but of course it has to do with halal and also kosher religious slaughtering. What I would like to conclude is that, well, we don't have a direct public regulation on halal, we only have indirect impact on halal food, and this is mostly where we have a question of animal welfare that comes into tension with the freedom of religion. This is how in the European Union we will have some legal importance for halal measures. By contrast, and this is the third part of the presentation, I want to examine also how domestic halal regulation comes under scrutiny in international law, so in WTO law. do you all know what the WTO is, more or less? It's the World Trade Organization. And possibly you've heard about this case, which is Indonesia is open to chicken imports from Brazil after the WTO ruling. So this is something that went, I think, through the press quite a lot in Indonesia. Well, as you know, the WTO is in favor of free trade, and I would like to discuss with you what was really said in the case, because I think sometimes in the media this case is very much misrepresented for how it relates to halal, actually. What was really at issue? Basically, Brazil made a complaint in the World Trade Organization forum against Indonesia. And they said that there is a barrier to trade, and this concerned chicken cuts. So I also want to point out, maybe the headlines are sometimes wrong. It's not about the whole chicken, it's really about a specific product which is mostly frozen and which is definitely only chicken cuts and not the whole chicken. So the problem, and I will simplify this slide a little bit, is that in Indonesia, in order to import any product, you have to follow a quite complicated system, but I think in any country, importation is a little bit administrative and complicated. However, the way it works is that you have to have the MOA and the MOT recommendations, which are based on a positive list. So only if a certain product is on this list, can you get even the recommendation for importation. And the problem is that chicken cuts, so only the chicken cuts and some related products, they were not on this positive list, and so it was not even possible to enter the entire system at all. The system itself, it may be a little bit complicated or complex, but it's fine. The problem that was attacked by Brazil was simply, chicken cuts are not on the list where you can get the forms and everything, so you cannot actually get an allowance or the recognition to import chicken cuts to Indonesia. So this is the main problem and really the precise problem that was at issue. So sometimes I feel the case is a bit misrepresented because it's just about importation of all chicken products. No, it's a very specific and unfortunately technical legal problem that was the problem in this case. Basically because these kind of products are not in the list, you cannot get the okay from the government and you cannot import it. This is very simply put what was the problem. How does WTO law work? As you probably know, in the World Trade Organization, the main paradigm, the main dogma is really you want to have free trade, and therefore a ban on something is considered a barrier to trade. It's considered bad. In technical terms, this is no prohibitions or restrictions other than duties, taxes, or other charges. So basically you have free trade unless you have a justification. So it is possible to make some restrictions on importation, for example, but you have to say why these restrictions are okay. So the basic principle is free trade unless you have a justification. So if there is an obstacle, and I will show you that this was clearly the case with the chicken cuts, then you must meet one of the justifications. And this is the technical rule for those that are interested in it. This is Article 20 of the WTO. In the Indonesia-Brazil case, not even Indonesia disputed that there was a ban or a problem of trade. Indonesia argued that it's justified, but Indonesia did not dispute that there is actually an obstacle to trade. So this is quite important to understand. It was clear that there was a problem, that there was a restriction to free trade, but Indonesia argued it's justified. Why? It used one of the official justifications of the WTO, and this is to secure compliance with Indonesia's laws and regulations dealing with halal requirements. So basically, Indonesia said, oh, we have so many cases of fraud on halal that actually we want to just ban the importation, because with chicken there's a lot of fraud going on, and it's safer and it's more clear that we simply ban chicken cuts from being imported. This is the argument. There is a legal test for justifications in the WTO law, and the first one is, well, is a measure not incapable of securing compliance? So that's a very loose one. And the second one is a question, well, is this really necessary? So if you want to translate it to this case, it's the question, well, is this positive list system, was it suitable to do this? What they try to do to safeguard the halal standard? And the second one, is it really necessary to have a total ban on chicken cut imports? Is it really necessary to have a total ban also? The panel, so the answer of the WTO dispute settlement body, if you want the court, the WTO court, it said, we have some doubts, but we do consider that a ban does indeed help some way halalness security on the market. But they were not convinced on the question whether the positive list was really necessary. Why? We have in the law, we always establish different tests, and these are the 4 tests that we use to see whether something is necessary. And especially for those that think that the case was against halal regulation, this is clearly not actually the case if you read it very carefully. Because the first question is, well, is halal insurance important? And the court was very clear in saying, yes, this is an important and recognized and legitimate value in society and a legitimate aim. So actually the court confirms that halal is a very important societal value. Does this list contribute to the measure? Here the court went into the detail and made quite smart arguments in my view, because the problem was, for instance, that only chicken cuts were targeted while whole chicken were not subject to the same measure. So there is some inconsistency in the argumentation. It's simply not logic. If it's valid for chicken cut, why not for chicken? But if it's okay for chicken, why is it not okay for chicken cut? So the problem was simply the measure was internally a little bit inconsistent and illogical at the end of the day. And the second question is, okay, but if you want to ensure halalness, why do you ban every chicken cut, even the chicken cut that is produced halal? So there were some logical problems with the measure itself, because yeah, it didn't exempt very systematically everything. The third element is trade restrictiveness, and clearly a ban on import is one of the most trade restrictive measures you can take. And the fourth test that's usually applied is whether there are alternatives. And here the court said, well, the certification procedures in place for other products, they are okay. So this is an alternative. And actually, although the case is sometimes read as attacking the Indonesian halal regime, it's a quite strong confirmation of the regime. Because in the case, it said that the certification procedure that you have for all the other products, except for chicken cuts, is okay. So this is maybe my main argument, that I think the case is misread in many ways against halal regulation at domestic level, while in reality, I think you have to make a very close reading of what is being said. It clearly recognizes the legitimacy of halal regulation, and it also clearly legitimizes certification systems for halal at domestic level. So actually, I think the WTO was quite positive for Indonesia at the end of the day. Apart from this particular measure. Among other claims, the case also addressed directly halal labeling, and here I want to point out that Brazil even lost their argument. So again, this is another point where in the judgment we find strong confirmation of some way of domestic halal regulation in the form of certification that it is allowed under WTO law. At the end of the day, what they were attacking is a halal labeling exemption for small quantities sold at markets. And here the court clearly distinguished between, yeah, on a small market, it's one thing. If you have a frozen product, it's another thing. And Brazil lost this claim. So again, it's not a loss for Indonesia. It's mostly a loss at this point for Brazil. As a bigger conclusion, I think for the case, yes, this is a very specific issue, and you must understand how specific the legal regulation was that was being attacked by the WTO law here. I don't think it means very much for halal certification in a bigger system. And also Brazil really clearly raised many concerns and lost most of them, I have to say. So hereby I would like to conclude and wrap up. The first argument that I want to make is that with a wider understanding of food security, it can also cover halal food measures because it is a preference of consumers to consume halal food. That's quite clear. The regulatory design of halal systems is from a legal point of view very important. So if you speak about, oh, is halal legal or not, it really depends what is the specific regulatory regime that you're talking about. We saw that in the European Union, we have a very different regime from, for example, Indonesia, and the WTO case shows that it really depends also what kind of restrictions you're imposing. So really the devil is in the detail, as they like to say, and it depends very much how do you design domestic halal regulation. Yes, so in comparison, I would say that in the EU, the main tension is animal welfare and freedom of expression, while at the WTO level, it's really about how do you design a system so that it's not a trade obstacle. Therefore, halal regulation as such is not a problem for international trade, it's really the design of halal certification systems. And I hope maybe the next speaker will elaborate on some of these points. And I thank you for your attention. We open the floor for questions. Or later. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.